So I start with a quote from Jung, which I think is quite an important quote given what the material we're going to be looking at. And it explains a little bit about my holding that polarities and an understanding of polarities is really crucial to not only the astrological project, but the psychological project as well. So Carl Jung said, just as all energy proceeds from opposition, which I think is a good start to a statement, all energy proceeds from opposition, so too the psyche possesses its innate polarity, this being the indispensable prerequisite for its aliveness. It's only alive because it possesses polarity. The psyche is only alive because it possesses polarity. Both theoretically and practically, polarity is inherent in all living things. So the implication here really is that without things being in some form of polarity or oppositional nature, there is no energy. And if there's no energy, there's no life, there's no living. So we're talking about something very fundamental here. That's what I believe. And it's something that I think we are all working with innately all the time in our work with astrology, but I'm just trying to bring it out a little bit into something that we continue to stay very aware of. I'm just going to leave you, as I do, a little bit more of an introduction with this image, which I think is an important image for me personally. It was one that when I was very early in my astrological career, in my late 20s, I put together a leaflet advertising my wares, and this was on the cover, which was an image that had spoken to me in a way, and I'd never really spent much time with it. It just sort of jumped out at me, and it was an image that I decided conveyed something about what I was about and what astrology was about. But since then, I have just come back to it many times, and it feels like it conveys something important about me and my process, but also about astrology and what we're doing as astrologers. So I'm just leaving it there as a kind of an inspiration. I think of it almost like a dream image, as somebody might work with a childhood dream. This is an image that's an ongoing one that I come back to. Okay, so I think one of the aspects of this that I think speaks of polarity to me is the two-ness that we see at the top with these two reptiles of some sort, with their tongues poking out, and out of their mouth is coming these two streams of vapors, which in some ways speaks of this primary separation and opposite notion of opposites. We also see two-ness and polarization in the sun and the moon image that's behind them. And I think these two streams, I notice, cut through my life in so many ways, and particularly astrological. I moved to the UK to study with the CPA, and I was particularly drawn to the work at that time of Liz Green. So I think that was the beginning thread for me around my astrological career, is the inner life that is under the spotlight through the psychological astrology project, this idea of using astrology in partnership with psychology, Jungian psychology particularly, to understand myself, but also understand my clients. And in many ways, this has formed the core of my practice. Whilst I was there and studying it, I became quite smitten by horary astrology, and I wrote to a horary practitioner at the time in the UK called Olivia Barclay, who some of you may have heard of. She was quite important at holding the stream of more traditional astrology in the UK, particularly through horary. And I wrote to her asking if I could train in horary with her, and she wrote me back a very fiery letter, which hurt me a great deal, but basically said, no, I can't, I'm not going to take you on as a student because I can't see how you can reconcile the opposites between your psychological trajectory of astrology and a more traditional approach that underlines horary. And so I got hurt and saw, okay, and I accepted it for a while, and shelved the idea of studying horary, but it was something that called to me. Eventually, I picked it up with the Company of Astrologers, and that's Jeffrey Cornelius and Maggie Hyde and other people who have formed this company of astrologers that work with all sorts of different levels of astrology, but Hori is one of the mainstays of their practice. And studying Hori alongside of my practice as psychological astrology has been a really rich interface, and I kind of see where Olivia Barclay was coming from. I find it immensely difficult to find the conversation between these two different streams, but I also find it really rewarding and quite essential in many ways for my own path, and is trying to find that conversation between the traditionalist in me and the astrologer in me, and the psychologically oriented astrologer in me. And I also saw that in my interest in process-oriented astrology, which is process-oriented psychology, which I think is working on Jung's ideas, but then trying to look at them in a way that's more embodied, more external, more worldly. And from the critique that Jung, perhaps his psychology didn't acknowledge the outer as much as the inner, underplayed the outer. So process-oriented psychology, for me, attempted to reconcile that inner-outer split and inner-outer balance. And that's what I believe, for me, a traditional astrology is starting to bring out in me. It's countering my strong inner stance that psychological work has given me, and equipped me with a greater understanding of astrology manifesting embodied in life events and in situations. So I feel very excited by this marriage that's increasingly part of my practice, is the bringing together of the traditional and the more modern. So yeah, it's not an abandoning of my psychological practice, but it's a kind of an infusion and a challenge to find a way through. And the second way, I wanted to just name the importance of polarities for me, and that is being a Southern Hemisphere born astrologer, and cutting my astrological teeth in the Northern Hemisphere and spending 10 years working there, being very aware of the Northern Hemisphere bias of aspects of our astrology, or at least some of our more fundamental and often unexamined ways we understand astrology and we communicate astrology when we're teaching it. And I notice it's every time I'm teaching the zodiac signs to my students, and I draw on the metaphor of the seasons, I end up in this really difficult terrain, given that Aries in the Southern Hemisphere happens to be in autumn, not in spring. Something that many of you may have already looked at, but I would very much encourage you to keep that that thought in your mind when and if you're teaching the zodiac signs, and when you're engaging with the zodiac as and your understanding of through the metaphor, the analogy of the seasons, which I think has been a fundamental way of understanding the development of the zodiac since Ptolemy in the 1st century AD. So as a Southern Hemisphere astrologer, this provokes real disquiet for me, how we make sense of an astrology that is really a Northern Hemisphere construct, and makes me question whether maybe we have to move beyond locating it too physically in the physical realm of the seasons, for example. And as somebody who's interested in, my kids have been to a Steiner school, which are very seasonally oriented, very connected with the seasons. It's a Northern Hemisphere education system. I'm very aware of the way that the Southern Hemisphere continues to celebrate the festivals 6 months, at the same time, but 6 months out by seasons. I'm very aware of what it is to be born in the Southern Hemisphere and what this provokes as a disjoint, sort of a mismatch. And I bring that in because I feel like this also conveys something of the polarity that exists within astrology, given the world is made up of 2 hemispheres. And the current way I'm playing with it is just looking to see how we might see something of the opposite sign within each sign. How we might see the shadow or the echo, or some hint of Taurus in Scorpio, or some sense of Aquarius in Leo, etc.